Allah Azza wa Jal chooses to gift us as His creation, the gift may come wrapped in a wrapping that from a human perspective feels like it is wrapped in difficulty, feels like we are going through something that is a grave struggle and a grave test. And one of the best examples that we can see, and an example that is so relevant to these days of Dhul Hijjah as we head towards Eid al-Adha, is the journey of the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam.
Ya Ibrahim.
These 10 days of Dhul Hijjah that we are currently in are days that are so filled with blessings and days that are meant to allow us the opportunity to reflect and to think about not just where we've been, but where we're going. During these 10 days of Dhul Hijjah, it's a time for us to seriously ask ourselves, what is the state of our hearts? How is our spiritual connection with Allah? What is it that we can do to ensure that the connection that, we focus very much on during Ramadan to build, we focus very much on, in those 29 days of Ramadan through our fasting and through our ibadah, but sometimes we lose sight of continuing to maintain and to uplift that spiritual connection during the best 10 days that Allah Azza wa Jal has decreed for us. So during this time of reflection, during this time of thinking about where we are and where we want to be, one of the core elements of Dhul Hijjah and the core lessons that we take from these days is a lesson in tawakkul, a lesson in truly trusting Allah and acting upon what it means to have utter taslim, to recognize that Allah Azza wa Jal is the one who is in charge of everything that exists in our dunya, in charge of that which comes to us, that which we may experience, that we may in the moment feel is a hardship, a struggle, and that which we experience that in the moment we may feel is the greatest gift and the greatest joy. We know that the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was considered Hanif Allah, the friend of Allah. And we know that from a young age he too was tested, and that he was tested by those who were closest to him. His own father was the one who was an idolater, who was in charge of those around him, who commanded that he be burned in a fire because he believed in La ilaha illallah. And we see that even in that difficulty, even in that test of Ibrahim alayhi salam having to be catapulted into a fire, and the catapult was built by the people of his town with his own father leading the charge. That catapult was built because the fire was so hot that they couldn't come near it. And the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, with full yaqeen, with full confidence and belief in the hikmah of Allah, with full confidence that Allah Azza wa Jal would protect him, went ahead, stayed firm in his faith, didn't waver, didn't shake. And we know that Allah Azza wa Jal, in His infinite rahmah, in His infinite mercy, in His ability to do that which as human beings we sometimes can't even fathom, Allah Azza wa Jal could have ended the difficulty and the struggle of Ibrahim before he was cast into the fire. Allah Azza wa Jal could have protected Ibrahim alayhi salam from being thrown into the fire. Allah Azza wa Jal could have kept him away from that difficulty and that hardship. And yet it was decreed for Ibrahim alayhi salam to be thrown into that fire because Allah Azza wa Jal in His hikmah knew that He would command the fire to be cool upon the skin of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and that even through that difficult test and punishment, there would be a further commitment, a further intensity in that tawakkul of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And this fire, much like many of the fires that we experience and we go through throughout our lives, metaphoric fires, metaphoric difficulties that we experience, that in the moment we may be asking ourselves, why, Ya Allah, are you putting me through this? Why do I have to go through this difficulty? And it may take years later until we are able to connect the dots and realize that this difficulty, this test, was a blessing wrapped in a packaging that from the human perspective may have made it feel like it was a struggle and a test that we were questioning. And so Ibrahim alayhi salam, as difficult as his relationship with his own father was, recognizing that it was his father that wished ill upon him and caused him this pain of wanting to throw him into the fire, we also see that years later, Ibrahim alayhi salam's greatest wish, one of his greatest dua, was to be a father himself, was to have his own child. And it may have been because of his difficulty and the tests that he had with his father, that he in his heart knew that if he were blessed as a father, that he would be very close to his son, that he would be the father that maybe he never had. And yet again, we see Ibrahim alayhi salam tested over and over in that which he desired. And so we see that when he is first gifted with his son Ismail alayhi salam, a dua he had made for a very long time. And imagine your dua being answered and then Allah Azza wa Jal testing you in your attachment to this dunya by telling you, you must leave this dua. This the answer to your dua. You must step away from that which you were gifted. And so Ibrahim alayhi salam was commanded, of course, to leave Ismail alayhi salam, the son he had yearned for, the son that he wanted to be the father for, the father that he never had. And he is commanded upon the birth of Ismail alayhi salam to leave Hajar radiallahu anha and Ismail alayhi salam in the desert. And we see again the test of tawakkul here. Just as Ibrahim alayhi salam had to exhibit the utmost tawakkul, reliance upon Allah, in moving forth, committing to his deen, holding on to La ilaha illallah even as he was thrown into the fire, in this moment when he is tested with leaving his beloved son, who he has not even had the opportunity to enjoy yet, leaving him in the desert, it is his tawakkul again that's being tested. And we see that Allah Azza wa Jal surrounds us with people sometimes that are meant to help uplift us and elevate us, just as we are also surrounded by people who are meant to test us and put us through difficulty. And so just as the father of Ibrahim alayhi salam was the opposite of what he needed in terms of someone who believed in Allah and believed in him and believed in the words of Ibrahim alayhi salam of monotheism, he was also gifted with Hajar radiallahu anha, who had that same strength of tawakkul. And we see that Ismail alayhi salam as an infant in the arms of his mother, as his mother carried him into the desert and walked behind Ibrahim alayhi salam, she asked questions. She would ask Ibrahim alayhi salam, why are you doing this? And Ibrahim alayhi salam did not answer. And she asked again, why are you leaving us in the desert? And Ibrahim alayhi salam did not answer. And then a third time she asked and said, is this a commandment from your Lord? And when Ibrahim alayhi salam answered in the affirmative, her response was again one of tawakkul, one of that pure reliance upon Allah when she said, then surely our Lord will provide for us. This is someone that Allah Azza wa Jal gifted Ibrahim with as his partner in terms of the mother of his child. And we know that when Hajar radiallahu anha sat with Ismail alayhi salam and Ismail alayhi salam shed those tears, her tawakkul, her reliance upon Allah, it never wavered. It never decreased. And even as she committed to striving back and forth between Safa and Marwa, sa'i, which means to strive, and something that we replicate in her footsteps today, she looked for that water, but she had full yaqeen, full confidence that that water would come, that Allah would provide the provision. And this is a tawakkul, a simple, honest tawakkul that again we see in Ibrahim alayhi salam, where he had that full tawakkul even in leaving his son Ismail. Now we see that this was not the end of the tests. We see that soon after, when Ismail alayhi salam had grown and he was in his teenage years, we see that again Ibrahim alayhi salam is tested in terms of zuhd. And the act of zuhd is being able to detach oneself from the dunya, from that which we may love the most in this dunya, in light of recognizing that Allah Azza wa Jal will always provide us with that which is better, that Allah Azza wa Jal will always lead us towards that which is better in our dunya and in our akhirah. And so Ibrahim alayhi salam is tested again with that act of zuhd. And as Ismail alayhi salam in his teenage years, as Ibrahim alayhi salam is developing that relationship as father and son, connecting with his son, he is commanded to sacrifice Ismail alayhi salam. And yet we know what a heavy burden this was for Ibrahim alayhi salam. He had been tested so many times, tested in the relationship between him and his own father, tested in being commanded to leave his son as an infant and to leave Hijjah radiallahu anha, tested again now in the teenage years of his son with a commandment to sacrifice him. And as Ibrahim alayhi salam, with a heavy heart, begins to move towards Ismail alayhi salam, he pauses and he hears these whispers that he should not move forward, that this is his son. And yet again, as we replicate in the journey of Hajj, he throws the pebbles at the jamarat to silence shaitan, to ensure that those negative whispers telling him not to obey the commandment of Allah are silenced. Because how many times do we set our intention to do something to please Allah, and then we find that we may be derailed? We find people may be telling us, oh, you don't really want to do that. We find ourselves, our own nafs whispering against us. We find shaitan pushing us away from the act of doing good. And so Ibrahim alayhi salam, Hanif Allah, the friend of Allah, is walking towards this act that he knows he must move forward with because it is the commandment of Allah. And he is strengthening his tawakkul by silencing the whispers that are pushing him to say, don't do it, don't do it. And Ibrahim alayhi salam, even with that full strength and that tawakkul, he still approaches his son Ismail alayhi salam with heaviness in his heart. And he speaks to his son and he tells him that he has been commanded, he's seen in a revelation, in a dream, that he must sacrifice him. And what is so beautiful in terms of tawakkul and the impact of father and son and mother and son, and how what we do and how we act and things that we say can impact our children without us even realizing. When he presents this to Ismail alayhi salam, the answer that Ismail alayhi salam gives is one that is reminiscent of what his mother had said years before. And he said, if this is a commandment from your Lord, then surely our Lord will protect us and provide. And in that moment, we see the strength of tawakkul, that because both father and son have that strength of reliance upon Allah, in that moment, the act of zuhd that was being tested, the ability to detach from the dunya, is shown. And the reward for the obedience of Allah, of course, is good, because we know that هل جزاء الإحسان إلا الإحسان. We are reminded in the Quran in Surah Ar-Rahman that can there be any other reward than good for those who do good? And so knowing that Ibrahim alayhi salam, knowing that Ismail alayhi salam, knowing that Hajar radiallahu anha were all the doers of good, then how can there be an outcome other than good? Even when the teenager Ismail alayhi salam, his head is on the chopping block, and Ibrahim alayhi salam is about to engage in this act of absolute taslim, of willingly submitting to Allah, submitting to the commandment of Allah. In that moment, we know that the act is averted. And rather than sacrificing his son, it is an animal, a lamb that is sacrificed, or a ram that is sacrificed. And we know that we walk in these footsteps of Ibrahim alayhi salam, we walk in the footsteps of Ismail alayhi salam, we walk in the footsteps of Hajar radiallahu anha, we walk in these footsteps during these 10 days of Dhul Hijjah, whether we are actually in Hajj, physically walking in those same pathways, or we are not blessed to be in Hajj maybe during these 10 days, but metaphorically walking in these footsteps. We walk in these footsteps by strengthening our own tawakkul, by strengthening our resolve and our willingness to give up our will for the sake of Allah. By trusting Allah and recognizing that even when there is a fire that is raging in front of us, and we know that we are on the cusp of imminently being thrown into that fire, trusting that Allah will save us, that He will protect us. When we are in the brink of having to be separated from that which we love, having to sacrifice that which we have made sincere dua for, having absolute tawakkul and trust that Allah's hikmah, His wisdom, is greater than any human knowledge, and that He will protect us. And so during these 10 days of Dhul Hijjah, and as we move towards Eid al-Adha, and we think and reflect and ask ourselves, where have I been? Where am I now? And where am I going? This is the opportunity, the moment, the time for us to check the state of our heart. Where is our heart? Is it anchored to Allah or is it anchored to this dunya? Is our heart truly reliant upon Allah and filled with trust towards Allah and recognition and belief that Allah will protect us and provide for us? Or are we shaky? And one of the best tests to see the status of our heart is in our dua. When we make dua with full yaqeen, full confidence that Allah will answer our dua in a way that is best for us. This is the greatest act of worship, because in so doing, we are showing that we are not in command of what will happen to us and that we are comfortable with submitting our will to Allah. This is the essence of Islam, taslim. So I pray that Allah Azza wa Jal allows us all to have hearts that truly do submit to His will. I pray that Allah allows us to strengthen our tawakkul and allows us to be like Ibrahim alayhi salam in these 10 days of Dhul Hijjah, truly submitting our will to Him and Him alone.